Every winter, cattle ranchers across North America do the same thing. They bring the herd in. They fill the barn. They spend the next 4 or 5 months cutting hay, hauling bales, cleaning manure out of confined yards, and paying for every single bite those animals eat. It costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of labor, and it is the way ranching has been done for as long as most people can remember. And according to a group of Canadian ranchers who started questioning it in the 1990s, it is also largely unnecessary. Research across Canada has shown that keeping cattle out of pens and grazing them through the winter on standing crops and strategically placed bales can reduce daily feeding costs per cow by 41 to 48%. Not a small improvement, not a marginal gain. Nearly half the cost of feeding a herd through winter gone. The practice is called extended grazing. It started on the Canadian prairies with a handful of ranchers willing to ask a question the rest of the industry hadn't thought worth asking. What if winter didn't have to mean the barn? They let the cattle harvest their own feed. The most expensive part of feeding cattle in winter is not the feed itself. It is everything that happens between the feed growing in the field and the animal eating it, the cutting and the baling and the hauling and the storing, then hauling it again to wherever the cattle are, and distributing it every single day through 4 months of frozen ground and short days and machinery that breaks at the worst possible moment. Trevor Atchison at Poplar View Stock Farm in Saskatchewan put it plainly. Any time you can graze a blade of grass that you didn't have to cut, bale, harvest, or store, it's cheaper. The first extended grazing practice Canadian ranchers developed was swath grazing. In late summer, grain crops, oats, barley, triticale, are swathed and left lying in the field in long rows called swaths. When winter comes, the cattle are turned out to graze the swaths directly. Nobody hauls anything. The animals walk to the feed themselves, which sounds almost too simple until you've spent a February morning trying to get a tractor started at -25. The swath is already there, cured by the fall air, lying on top of stubble that keeps it off the frozen ground and accessible, even under moderate snow cover. Research showed swath grazing alone reduced yardage costs by 78% compared to conventional dry lot feeding. The cattle were healthier. The soil under the swaths received a direct deposit of manure rather than a pile in a corral that had to be loaded, hauled, and spread separately. What sounded like laziness was actually the most efficient system anyone had designed. They spread the bales across the field. For ranchers whose winters were too severe for swath grazing to work reliably, Canadian researchers developed a second system. Instead of hauling bales to a central feeding area, they placed the bales directly in the pasture or hayfield before winter arrived, spread across the landscape in deliberate patterns, rationed to the cattle by moving a portable electric fence every 2 to 5 days. Bale grazing. The cattle walked out to wherever the bales were, rather than the rancher driving feed to wherever the cattle stood. The manure spread across the entire field, rather than accumulating in one corner. And after just 1 year of bale grazing, a 1997 research study showed pasture growth in those fields doubled. Not because anyone added fertilizer, because the cattle had distributed what the soil needed evenly across the ground as part of their normal behavior, doing in a winter season what would have taken a rancher a spring of hauling manure and a spreader truck to replicate. The economics of bale grazing convinced enough ranchers that by 2016 more than 35% of Canadian beef cattle farms were using some form of in-field winter grazing. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, the number was closer to 45%. They matched the animal to the feed. The ranchers who made extended grazing work were not simply turning cattle loose in a field and hoping for the best. They were making careful distinctions the conventional dry lot system never required, because in a dry lot you can control exactly what every animal gets. In a winter pasture, a young cow in her first pregnancy has different nutritional requirements than a dry cow between calves. Canadian ranchers learned to read the herd. the way the Australian outback farmers learned to read the grass, dividing cattle into groups based on what stage of production they were in, matching each group to the forage quality available, supplementing where necessary. It required more attention than tossing hay bales over a fence twice a day. What it produced was healthier cattle. At the end of winter, animals that had maintained body condition. On feed, they harvested themselves in the open air, moving across ground instead of standing in mud. The health numbers followed. Respiratory disease, the chronic cost of confined cattle breathing each other's air through a prairie winter, dropped significantly on operations that moved to extended grazing. They measured what it actually cost. For most of the 20th century, the cost of wintering cattle was simply accepted as the cost of wintering cattle. Nobody had really sat down and broken it apart, labor per cow per day, what the equipment actually cost to run over a winter, the manure handling, the building maintenance, the yardage fees that accumulated quietly in the background of every conventional operation. The Canadian ranchers who adopted extended grazing were forced to measure those things because the whole argument for the practice rested on the numbers. What they found was that the visible cost, the feed bill, was only part of the picture. The hidden costs, yardage, labor, equipment, manure, buildings, were often larger than the feed cost itself, and almost all of them were eliminated or drastically reduced by keeping the cattle in the field. A quarter-century of research from the Beef Cattle Research Council of Canada confirmed what the early adopters had been saying. Since the 1990s, extended grazing consistently reduced total winter feeding costs by 40 to 48% across a wide range of Canadian operations. By the time a quarter-century of research from the Beef Cattle Research Council had accumulated behind the practice, ranchers in the northern United States, parts of Europe, and New Zealand were looking at the Canadian numbers and asking why they were still hauling hay every morning at -20. They changed what winter meant. The deepest shift wasn't about cost. It was about what winter was for. In conventional cattle ranching, winter was a period to endure. You fed the animals through it, kept them alive, and waited for spring, when the real work could resume. The Canadian ranchers who built extended grazing systems turned winter into a productive season. The cattle were still feeding soil. The manure was still building organic matter. The perennial grasses underneath the snow were still being stimulated by hoof traffic and grazing pressure to grow deeper root systems. Winter stopped being a pause in the operation. It became part of the operation. The land that cattle wintered on outperformed the land they were kept off in terms of forage yield the following spring, because the cattle had done to that ground in winter what no fertilizer program could replicate as cheaply. The ranchers who figured this out weren't working with better land than their neighbors, or better rainfall, or any particular advantage that made the thing easier for them than it would be for someone else. They just stopped treating winter as something to get through and started treating it as part of what the operation was supposed to do. The next time you see cattle standing in a winter corral, ankle-deep in mud waiting for the hay truck, that is one way to get through winter. The Canadian ranchers who built Swath grazing and bale grazing and spent 25 years backing them up with real research numbers weren't working with some new invention. What changed was simpler than that. The assumption that winter feeding had to look the way it had always looked turned out to be wrong, and the ones who questioned it early enough had been saving 40 to 48 cents on every dollar of winter feed costs ever since. New stories every week on Deep Furrow.